Hey, this is Jack the Lesser.
I never know what to say when he says that. This is
Yeah.
Jack the Lesser's dad.
Yeah.
Oh man, what about Jack the Greater? That was your
Does
your
it make you
shot.
feel disappointed? Like, it sounds like you're disappointed in me if you refer to me as that.
I just think people could misunderstand where I'm coming from.
And this is the pastor with no answers, and that's why I always bring smart people on this show. And I don't know. So let's see. Yeah, I don't have any choice but when I say Jack, that means Jack the Greater, and I'm gonna call Jack the Lesser. I'll just call you Lesser. Is that okay?
That's fine with me.
All right, Lesser. Cool.
I've made my peace.
but Jack, I don't know. I don't know if I told both of y'all this or just one of you, but I actually referred to Jack as Jack the Greater one time, and someone chimed in. They were being serious, and they were seriously a little freaked out. They're like, "Dude, you think you're taking these people a little too far? Like, why would you call him Jack the Greater?" Like, he really thought that I was a little too intense with characterizing you guys. But hey, who is smarter? Who's smarter out of you two?
Gosh. Well, I mean, we've both agreed to do this with you numerous times, so that doesn't really speak well of either.
Oh goodness!
I like to say that he stands on my shoulders. So right, so he grew up. He kind of absorbed everything that I know, and then he's added to it. So
Yeah, but,
so that would imply he's smarter.
On the other hand, and also, I came on staff here at Seacoast First, and I was really happy to help you out.
Yeah.
And
show me the ropes.
Yeah. Come let you ride my coattails.
All right, so I know that y'all have both had, unfortunate for the other person, but fortunate for you guys to get a good laugh for the day, but y'all have had situations in which someone was emailing you thinking it was the other. Do y'all have easily the best story in which that happened, where you were just like, oh my gosh, I cannot believe they just emailed me that stuff? Like, given that Jack, you kind of oversee everything at Seacoast, has anyone ever emailed
some confidential personnel information to my son?
Yes.
Yeah, it happened last week. And it was marked like, this is very confidential. And so I just emailed the person back, and all I said was confidential in quotation marks.
So here's a mildly humorous one that isn't directly related to what you're saying, but last week I'm in my office, and the director of our global missions group, Jody, poked her head in, and she says, "You're coming to this meeting, right?" I said, "What are you talking about?" She said, "We have a meeting with Jack Little." And Jack is a guy who's kind of a prominent nonprofit leader in our community. And I know Jack. And I said, "Nobody sent me anything on a meeting." She says, "Oh, no, I bet they invited your son instead." And I just said, "I'm sorry, I can't go." And so we talked about it. And I had met with Jack Little a week or so ago. I said, "Here's what I think he's going to want to talk about." And so she says, "Well, I'll go there and see what's going on." And so anyway, it turned out that they hadn't invited Jack Little either, that one of our pastors had said, "I want you to have a meeting with Jody and Jack Little." And so they invited my son.
Yeah. And afterwards, this is very amusing. And afterwards, when I found out that Jack Little was a real person, I emailed that admin, and I said, "Well, I'm really glad to know that Sam doesn't call me Jack Little." And she said, "Oh, no, he does."
That's awesome. I know that at least once I thought I was reaching out to Jack the Lesser to ask him to do something on this show, and I ended up writing Jack. And Jack, you were super kind and said, "Hey, by the way, if you wanted to reach my son, please feel free to ask." And I was like, "No, on second thought, I think you would do a good job." And then I have definitely emailed or texted Jack the Lesser in a way that silly peers and friends do. Not that I'm uncomfortable around you, Jack, but I'm not going to text you and call you an asshole. And I think I did that one time. I was so embarrassed. I was like, "Oh, great, my boss. I just called him an asshole," and maybe said something worse. I don't know. But yeah, that's got to be very entertaining for you guys. Well, people have heard this many times, and it's because it's true. Y'all have been very helpful to me, both of you, and just a lot of questions. I'll never forget when the first time I talked to Jack about how you saw the Bible and how you read the Bible, and I was like, wait a second, I'm at an evangelical church, and I know most of my church upbringing, people in my church upbringing would say this is heresy, but I don't think Jack's a heretic. And, that was just one of many conversations that I've had with y'all that's been super helpful. So thank y'all for that. And so what I thought we'd do, given that Easter's coming up and this episode will release 6 days before Easter, is to talk specifically about the death and resurrection of Jesus. And Jack the Lesser, very recently, I think it was on our intro to Ask Jack, you actually said something that blew me away, and it's kind of neat, and it does serve to the point that the Bible makes in don't give up meeting together, just because of the encouragement that comes from that. Like, it actually was kind of a faith booster when I asked you what your certainty was of Jesus' resurrection. You were just like, I have no doubt. I was like, good gosh, because you're kind of a skeptical person. You definitely will analyze stuff and, not too quick to believe. And the fact that you said no doubt, I was like, man, that is super interesting. So, but before we get into this discussion of why you guys are so convinced that Jesus indeed died and rose and validated who he said that he was, what are some important things that believers and unbelievers alike, and when I say believers and unbelievers, literally people that believe in the resurrection and people that don't, what are some good things for them to keep in mind, I guess, more context-oriented or maybe cultural things that we just completely overlook when it comes to this conversation?
Yeah, I think that, one thing that people tend to overlook, or at least people have a hard time considering, is that there could actually be, what we would consider evidence for the resurrection. A lot of times people think of evidence as, like guys in white coats in a laboratory doing experiments, and that's one kind of evidence. But there is such a thing as historical evidence, and I think that one thing that people tend to dismiss out of hand is the possibility that there could be evidence for the resurrection. I think that's sort of dismissed sometimes.
Gotcha. Do you agree with that, sir?
Yeah, I do. What I would say from the other side, it was interesting. I was talking to a young woman on our staff today she said, hey, let me bounce something off you. She was a member of a book club, and a kind of a spirited conversation came up in their book club the other night. She says, she and a good friend of hers are believers. She thinks they're the only ones who are in this club. And this other woman, who, was kind of talking about, I would say spiritual things in a very, I'll say, doubting way, and she's thinking, like, how do I respond to this? And so she was kind of coming to me and said, is there anything I should have said? And I said, well, first of all, don't feel like there's anything you should have said. But I just said, what I would encourage you to do is, you don't need to argue with her, but what you can share is your experience.
Yeah.
And, most people who come to faith as adults do it really because someone invites them to. A friend whom they trust, it enables them to consider the claims of the gospel from a perspective that they hadn't seen before.
Right.
And they're very rarely argued into it by let's go through the evidence, let's argue this logically. And I think that's the other side of things, is that ultimately it doesn't matter that the resurrection is true if it didn't make a difference.
Yeah.
But it has made a difference, for me and for, countless other people that I know.
Yeah. And that's really good. So in the sense that I think one thing so on the one hand, it's easy to sort of dismiss the idea that there could be evidence, but then on the other hand, it's very easy to see evidence and use it like a bludgeon against people, right? Like latch on to it is I'm going to, beat you over the head with this until you agree with me. And neither of those are good.
Yeah. Gotcha. So let's start with Jesus just as a person. Have you guys, because I know both of you well enough that there's atheists and people from other faiths that y'all have a great deal of respect for and find very smart people. Is there any argument for Jesus never having existed that is a good argument in y'all's opinion?
I mean, I would hate to just issue a blanket statement that no, there's no such thing as a good argument for that. But boy, I have trouble finding it.
Right.
There's just a lot of information in the historical record, and it's collected in a convenient place, right? But here's kind of my analogy too. So I studied Latin in high school. And when you're a second-year Latin student, you translate Caesar's commentaries because Caesar wrote short sentences and used short words, basically. He was a great writer, but kind of like a Hemingway in terms of style, right? Very easy to translate for somebody who's just learning the language. So I have never heard anyone argue that somebody other than Julius Caesar wrote Caesar's commentaries.
Right. Okay.
Now, when you're looking at ancient manuscripts, there's kind of a dividing line of about 400 AD. And, if you wanted to look at, if it's earlier than that, it's an old manuscript. If it's later than that, it's a later manuscript. And because 400 AD is about the time that Rome fell. So there was this huge disruption in terms of the major cultural center in the Western world. So do you know how many old pre-400 AD manuscripts or manuscript fragments there are of Caesar's commentaries?
Of Caesar's? It's definitely not over 100. I think maybe there's...
It's more like 5.
Yeah.
Okay? So for the least well-attested New Testament book, there are over 300.
Yeah.
And in terms of New Testament manuscripts themselves, I mean, the number last is 2,500.
Right.
Old manuscripts. So in other words, now again, having a lot of manuscript attestation isn't in itself a definitive answer, but it's one example of, if you wouldn't question that, why would you question this based on an overwhelming preponderance of evidence, relatively speaking?
Right, and that's with the assumption too that what the gospel writers wrote down was at least intended to be some sort of recording of actual events that took place. Like no one would read the gospel responsibly and say, oh yeah, they were making up a fairy tale. At the very least, this person, Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John, or whoever, wanted it to be a narrative, right?
Believed what they were saying. And I would argue we're close enough to what had happened that if it was a lie, they would have known it.
Yeah. Yeah. This conversation just really, really is interesting. Why? I guess because there's so much time removed between then and now, and obviously someone can just look out their window and say, well, there's no evidence for Jesus's resurrection. Why would I believe in that? It's just so easy to dismiss. But I think the little things that I have read, the books that I have read, it seems like if anyone does a deeper investigation in a very honest way, they at least have something pretty significant to grapple with.
Yeah. Well, again, there's stories of people who have gone in to prove that the Gospels were all a lie and ended up coming to faith by what they found out. Now, that's not the universal experience, but I really think, and I think one of the challenges, of course, is, and Jack has a really good grounding in history and historical method, and truthfully is more of a scholar than I am, but so when you start to look at historical evidence, not many people are equipped to do that very well.
Right.
I think it's one of the challenges in our society. Ironically, we have so much more apparatus to look analytically in a whole range of fields, and the ability to integrate, multiple disciplines together as we look to get an answer to a question. And yet the knowledge and the background that you have to be able to use that apparatus is more and more complex. Requires more and more education to get there. Fewer and fewer people are able to feel confident that they can exercise it well. So I do think that that's one challenge.
Yeah. Yeah. Lesser, how about you? Why are you so convinced just in general? Like if you've got a guy and he's not interrogating you and he really wants to know, it's like, hey, I don't believe, but you seem like a smart guy. Why do you believe this nonsense?
Well, yeah. So first, I want to kind of tack on to the end of what Dad said.
Yeah.
One of the things that makes studying historical evidence kind of different, and I think in some sense more challenging, is that it sort of requires you to take yourself out of your cultural circumstances and really try to understand someone from a completely different time, and that's difficult to do. It means basically doing your best to stand outside of your experience and your assumptions, because our tendency is to assume that every person's sort of tendency is to assume that their time and their culture is the best one.
Yeah.
So all the older ones, because they were long ago, they weren't as smart as us. They weren't as sophisticated as us. Of course, these silly peasants believed in Jesus. They were stupid peasants living 2,000 years ago. They believed all sorts of things. And that's sort of the attack a lot of people take about the virgin birth. Like, of course, these stupid people who lived 2,000 years ago believed in the virgin birth. They didn't know where babies came from.
Right.
And so one of the things that you have to do to really understand history is to stand outside of yourself and to be willing to see people on their own terms, without doing your best without making judgments about them. That's really, really difficult.
Yeah.
And one of the things it means is treating things as evidence that might not be the standard of our evidence. Because like one of the things, people, when people use the term history, they tend to sort of mean like objective reporting facts. And that's not what history meant then. If you were going to write a history, you were not, sort of writing this objective report. Why would you want to be objective? You have something to say, right? And you want people to understand your message. So anyway, that's a very long way of saying that, studying history and studying evidence in history is very, very different than studying a lot of different kinds of evidence. And I think it's uniquely difficult, especially for sort of like a bizarrely pompous culture like ours when it comes to, look, the ancient Romans were not especially woke people.
Right.
So, it's just, it can be very difficult to deal with them on their own terms. But if, so your question was, if someone said, boy, you seem like a smart guy, why are you so convinced? Do you mean about Jesus' existence or the resurrection? Or
resurrection, just the whole thing. Jack the Lesser, as best as you know how, given that you are a flawed human being, you are dedicating your life to this guy's teachings, and it's because you really believe that he rose from the dead, and you live in 2018. This apparently happened 2,000 years ago.
Yeah.
Why are you so convinced?
Well, and I'll probably change my answer 10 times before tomorrow, after I say this. But I would say that I think it is the best way to explain what happened 2,000 years ago, because something happened, right? Something happened, and you got to decide what it was. And I think that when you consider the evidence, from the sort of the entire narrative of God's work with His people, in the Old Testament,
yeah,
to the eyewitness accounts in the New Testament, to how do you explain the existence of the church?
Right.
Just those three things in themselves, the resurrection, like the physical resurrection, to me, is the best way to understand what happened 2,000 years ago.
Right. Just because Christianity is such a big religion, because couldn't someone say, well, Islam wasn't birthed from someone that rose from the dead, and that's alive and kicking?
Yeah. Well, and there are any of number of there are many things that are have many followers and they're very popular, and sort of they all sort of share this catalyzing event.
Yeah.
And so, what was that for Christianity? It was either the resurrection or it was nothing.
Right. Why couldn't it have been a fabrication and or a fake what's the word I'm looking for?
Fake news?
Yeah. Why couldn't it have been a practical joke? No. Like, what is there any way in y'all's mind could we be where we're at today as far as this many believers, this many churches, all sorts of evolution of the church and all of that, if the resurrection was a fake and it was a bunch of people that got together and said, hey, let's try to make it look like Jesus really did rise from the dead.
Yeah. Well, here's the thing, Joey. Let's just say that. Imagine that it started out that way.
Yeah.
Hey, I don't know what they would have imagined the payoff was from convincing everybody that this was true, but maybe they found a popular new religion and they're famous and they collect lots of money in the tithe boxes every week or something. I don't know. Okay. Don't you think that the motivation to sustain the lie would end when somebody said, I am going to torture you to death unless you recant?
Right.
Like, who would do that? And again, it kind of gets back to my point about the Gospels. Those guys were close enough to know if it was a lie.
Right.
Most of them died horrible deaths because of their faith, their belief in the resurrection, and their refusal to, even under pain of death, say that wasn't true. That's the part that I think, like, how do you argue that? Who would do that?
Right.
Who would die for something and it was a lie?
Right. Right. Or die for something that you're not totally sure of.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And I mean, have y'all read Case for Christ?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Like, do y'all find that book to be a pretty good resource that brings up good arguments? And, it's probably more of like a snapshot, surfacey depiction of, validity for the resurrection. But do y'all find that a valuable book for people to read?
It can be. I mean, I would say it's a snapshot. It's not I don't find it, wow, these proofs are overwhelming, but
right.
I think it's a good example of, here's a guy who came in expecting to debunk a myth and kind of found out, wait a minute, this actually not only makes sense, it's kind of the only really logical explanation of what happened.
Right.
And so he's writing from the point of view of a journalist. It's non-technical, that's for sure. But so I think from that point of view, it's an interesting read. And it might be a book I would give to somebody depending on who it was and what their thought process was.
Yeah. Yeah, and part of it depends just on how you're wired. I mean, so, I know that for me, especially when it comes to, did the resurrection happen, N.T. Wright and Richard Bauckham are, I mean, like if you want someone that, I don't really know what your argument is against what they have to say, but it's got to be pretty difficult. Those are two guys I would point to, but they're scholars, very difficult to read because N.T. Wright is gonna, goodness, he wrote several thousand pages on kind of the New Testament era.
Yeah.
And so it kind of depends on how you're wired, right? I mean, some of it you could read all of that, it's not going to make a difference, but you kind of like Dad was saying, you meet someone and they're the first person to care about you in 20 years, and that might be what you're like, wow, the resurrection is real.
Right.
And I would never have thought that without the kindness of this person.
Yeah. Yeah. So I've heard this question a lot, and I think that it's a valid thing to discuss. We have the majority of humanity not believing in Jesus as the Son of God and the resurrected Messiah, and a lot of those folks, it's because they've never heard, or a lot of them, maybe they've heard of what all those folks in America and other parts of the world believe in, but they were raised to, be Hindus or Muslims or whatever. But why, if the resurrection is real, and I know this is when we play God, which is never a great thing to do, but I understand why people do it, and I get caught up into it myself. But why wouldn't God just, if this is people's way of freedom, why wouldn't God just make it so clear so that people would make a decision based on, okay, well, I know it's true, and now I have to decide whether or not I want to give my life for it. But what I hear more than anything is, man, I'd love it if there was some hope out there. I just can't bring myself to believe it. Like, why would a loving God, for instance, just not make it super, super abundantly clear?
Yeah, it's funny. I debated a atheist here in Charleston down at one of the local colleges some years ago, and he's talking about there's lack of evidence. I just don't see the evidence. I said, okay. I said, well, tell me what evidence it would take to convince you.
Yeah.
And he kind of said with a smirk, well, like if God came down and planted himself on the stage and just started zapping people, that would be convincing.
Yeah.
I felt like saying, so if God reveals himself to be a cartoon character, then you'd believe in him. I mean, that makes a lot of sense.
Right.
But, do you see anything wrong with that? Okay, so could God compel submission? Yes. That's obviously not what he's after.
Yeah.
It's obviously after people who seek him because they desire to. He's after people who seek him voluntarily. Now you say, well, yeah, but couldn't he make it easier? I get that. And I don't have an answer for that. Like, why did he establish the degree of difficulty that exists, if you want to argue that there is one?
Right.
I don't know. But I feel like it does make sense that if what you wanted was people to seek you in love, that you wouldn't come down and terrify everybody and say, submit to me or else.
Yeah.
And unless how, and my views have changed on this a good bit, but there's still, I would say, a bigger question mark than anything. But I would agree with that. Like, that wouldn't seem to be God's approach unless there were billions of souls that relied on knowing that truth, and then for people that see a traditional view of hell, it's like, well, yeah, God's not going to force himself on people, but why wouldn't he? Because the only other alternative is really, really, really bad for people that die without knowing him.
I understand that. And again, I don't have an answer for that that's definitive. Oh, here's why.
Yeah.
But, I guess part of the way I process that, you can't help but ask that question.
Yeah.
I'm involved in a global missions organization, have been for a number of years. And, we're one of the biggest global mission organizations of the world.
Right.
And it seems so small compared to the billions of people who have never had the gospel explained to them. And sometimes it just seems so, like we're taking spoonfuls of sand out of the Sahara Desert. It's just seems like an insignificant effort.
Yeah.
And so then, the only, I guess, one response I have in terms of the way I pray about it is, God, I believe that you're a good and loving God, that and that your word says that you're not willing that any should perish. I don't know how that plays out, but that's kind of ultimately my faith is I don't know how God's going to handle all that, but I believe that God is good and loving.
Yeah.
Now it's possible that what good and loving looks like is different to God than it does to me. I would not therefore conclude that God was flawed and that I was not. I would just say there are things that I probably don't understand. So I realize somebody could look at that as a cop out, but that's kind of the way I frame it. Is there's just so much I don't know, can't know.
Yeah.
And
yeah. I mean, here's an interesting thought experience, which again, we're not going to get anywhere trying to think for God, but how more effective. Okay, God, you hearing me, right? You could have done it this way from Joey Svensson, but if he were to have done all this sending Jesus stuff like in 2000, where we could have got a bunch of footage, recorded a bunch of stuff, could you imagine the YouTube hits that his miracles would get? And then, oh my gosh, let's just have, he said he was going to rise. Let's just have a live cam on the tomb. We're good to go then, but I guess where my mind goes too, though, is it seems like, and I don't know if this was rebelliousness or unbelief, but God did seem to operate that way with Israel in making things very clear, and it seems like their hearts still gravitated toward. So it's like no matter how you slice it, it seems like humans end up figuring out a way to rebel regardless, because it seems like those guys saw very clearly who God was and did their own thing anyway.
Yeah, well, that's kind of what I was thinking in terms of the what if God just made it. What if God just did something that would make it unmistakable that He existed and that this was the way? It's like, and my sense is that, and pretty much everyone would still do what they were going to do anyway. And it's like, Joey, I don't want to make any assumptions, but I'm guessing that there are probably some things in your life that you should be doing differently, but you don't. Like, right. Everyone has those things. And so the idea that if only we knew what we should be doing, we would do them is that's crazy for anyone who
is it all self-aware?
Yeah, right. Like no one has any self-destructive tendencies at all, and is it really been your experience that the more people have their faults pointed out to them, the more ready they are to admit them? It's like I feel like it must be the opposite, and in terms of the, why didn't he come now? We're so connected. It's like, yeah, it seems that way, but at the same time, the world was pretty much ideally connected for when he did come, both in terms of the ability to travel, the freedom to travel, the peacefulness, the way the language was distributed, the way culture was distributed. I mean, we're more connected than we've ever been, and we hate each other more than we ever have.
Right.
Like, Twitter is a nightmare. It's like people get on Twitter and they, it's like, and one of the things that I hate about Twitter, genuinely hate, is watching guys that I respect and know are decent people behave terribly.
Right.
It's like a compulsion. And so it's like, yeah, like greater connectivity and greater division, greater isolation, right? So, yeah, for what that's worth.
Jack, do you agree with your son that you're 100% convinced? I mean, would you say it that way as well?
Well, what I would say is that I've staked my life on it. That I live my life based on principles that come directly from that fact, that everything I do relates to this God who loved me and cared for me and sent his son to die for me. And so, do I ever have moments of wondering whether what I believe is true? I mean, who doesn't have moments where you're down and where you wonder, like you can wonder about anything. I mean, there's nothing in human experience that you can't think, did I actually experience that? Did that happen yesterday, or did I dream that last night? You know?
Yeah.
But I think in the sense that Jack means it, yes, I'm absolutely committed to that belief. And when I say committed to it, I've thought about this as carefully as I can and from as many different angles as I can, because I'm kind of skeptical. I don't take things for granted. And this is the fundamental decision of my life. It's like, if I'm wrong on this, I've wasted my life, is the way I look at it.
Wow.
I don't want to be wrong.
Yeah.
And that doesn't mean that I can be certain that I'm right.
Yeah.
So if you said, have you ever experienced God's presence in your life? I would say yes. And I could tell you about times when that has happened. And someone who is a skeptic could say, yeah, but what you feel you experienced could have been this, could have been that. And I understand that. Nonetheless, it's my responsibility to interpret what happened, and I'm trying as carefully as I can to be as accurate as I can. I realize that it's possible that I'm wrong, but my responsibility is to be right if I can be.
Yeah.
And I take that seriously.
Yeah. Yeah. So I've heard a lot of people say, especially in recent days, and it sounds like I'm knocking it, but I think a lot of good comes out of very progressive Christian thought and people rethinking things and all of that. But there's I've heard a lot of people say things along the lines of, there's so much overlap amongst religions, and obviously when it comes to Islam, Judaism, and Christianity, of course there is. There's a lot of overlap, just given that it's kind of the same God there. But isn't it a stretch, or I'll put it this way. Isn't it obvious, though, that this whole incarnation, death, and resurrection of Jesus is very unique to everything else? Like, am I overlooking something to say that Christianity stands on its own 2 feet in a very extremely unique way?
I think if you're willing to look at those things, if you're willing to look at those things the way Christianity looks at itself, yes. Because one of the things that's very.
What do you mean by that?
Well, because you hear people say, oh, you can find religions where the gods became people, and you can find virgin births, and you can find resurrections. It's like, no, you can't if you mean those things the way Christians meant them, right? You can find gods masquerading as people. You don't find gods becoming human, right? And you don't find gods becoming human to help humans. And what you especially do not find is a bodily resurrection, like within history, as a way of vindicating that person. A bodily resurrection is not a good thing in the ancient world,
right?
Because the body is a prison. The physical world is inferior to the spiritual world. When Roman emperors would die, and if they were liked well enough, and the Senate wanted to have them proclaimed as gods, they would find a witness who would come into the forum, and they would say, I saw so and so emperor's star ascending to heaven, and that was sort of like the moment that, the witness of him becoming a god. In other words, like in the ancient world, the moment you became a god was the exact opposite of coming back to life in a physical body. If you came back to life in a physical body, the exact thing you were not was divine.
Wow.
And so it's like when people say, "Oh, these things happened," it's like, you can find similar things, but that isn't at all what Christians meant by them when they taught them.
Yeah.
Yeah. What's funny too, like kind of my analogy for that, it's like Jesus didn't really exist. Kind of like somebody made him up. It's like, find the guy who made him up. Who is that guy?
Yeah.
Totally.
Yeah, and that's actually one thing. So, getting back to couldn't the disciples have just made this up? Yeah, but really unlikely. Not just because they died for it, but because a bunch of fishermen created an extraordinarily sophisticated theological concept, of the Messiah not being a political figure, 2, the Messiah's defeat being his actual victory, and then the Messiah coming back to life in a body. Like, no one thought any of that stuff was going to happen.
And by the way, in his casual conversation, he was the most influential moral philosopher of all time.
Yeah, and so it's like, by the way, the people that you're trying to convince of this afterwards are the Jews. The people that more jealously guard their traditions and belief than any other people in the ancient world, because they are always, under threat.
Yeah.
Like, that's ridiculous. It's just like, you can believe that if you want. It's just a very, very, it seems very silly to me. Way sillier than the alternative.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. So a few more questions, and some of these that they're not too related together. But the first one is, why are, and both of you or one of you, why are you not bothered by the clear inconsistencies in gospel narrative?
Well, I think if you're talking about the kinds of inconsistencies that I think you are, like a lot of them take place in the resurrection story.
Yep. Like,
the one gospel, and there were 2 angels. Another one says there was 1 angel. And my argument is kind of twofold. So some people say, well, you got to rationalize all those things because inspiration demands that everything be perfectly true, whatever perfectly true means.
Right.
My kind of thing is actually it kind of shows that they didn't bother to coordinate their stories. I mean, they were trying to report as accurately as they could what they saw. And it was so shocking, such an astonishing thing that they couldn't wrap their minds around, that they were a little fuzzy on a couple of the details. Was there 1 angel, John? Now that you mention it, I don't know. 2, 1, I don't. That's the way memory is, really. Yeah. Here's this overwhelming event, and I'm conveying all of my stunned incomprehension about what's going on, and then all these circumstantial details. One of the things that kind of neuroscience has shown is the way that memory is distorted by stress and pressure and shock. So in my mind, it's true to that.
Yeah.
Yeah. And, one thing that really gets to, I've talked with a number of guys on these podcasts over the years who, I've had a conversation with the KJV only guy and people who, they need the Bible to be perfect, and perfect according to like a modern, basically engineering term. And that's just a very inappropriate definition of it. So what is a perfect flower, or what is a perfect sunset, or what is a perfect story? What does it mean for a story to be perfect? And trying to stick this engineering mathematical, term, like the way we mean perfect or perfection, onto a narrative is a very inappropriate category to try and force on any kind of story, even an inspired one. And more than that, the early church, obviously they circulate.
Well, Jack, before I lose this thought though, do you have any understanding of someone that says, but not if God is behind it? Like, why wouldn't God just make sure the details are correct?
Well, because we care about details, right? But what details are important? There are an infinite number of details that don't even make it into the page.
Yeah.
And so not all details matter. And again, that's applying a standard that we don't apply to other people, right? If someone gets some details wrong about a story we're telling, we don't say, I can't trust you anymore. And the idea that, because God is doing it, he is going to do it in this mathematical way. Well, why? Why?
Yeah.
Do you have anything to add to that before I get to it?
Well, I just think, and part of the thing, too, it's like, it's kind of like your conversation, the thing you were throwing out earlier, Joey, about the idea of, like, why couldn't God just appear now? We can have video footage of everything going on and the miracles, and okay, in 1,000 years from now, might the technology be even better? Sure. I mean, at what point do you reach the end of that? And I would say it's the same thing with the science of history. Have we learned anything about how to write history more accurately in the last 2,000 years? Yeah. Absolutely. So, how do you hold those guys, to that standard when that wasn't a standard that even existed for them?
Yeah.
It's like, my analogy would be, Joshua asked, praying that God would make the sun stand still. God did not say, Joshua, but before I answer this prayer, there's a couple things about the cosmos you need to understand. First of all, you kind of got the earth revolves around the sun, not the other way around. So really what you need to ask me to do, right? We don't have any problem saying Joshua prayed sincerely based on his limited belief, and God, answered his prayer based on the reality.
Yeah.
I just think maybe there's an analogy there in terms of the limited scope of the, how narratives were written in that age.
Yeah. It's like it's hard to believe that there would be more people who believed in the Bible if Joshua had if God stopped him and was like, whoa, look, you seem to have a heliocentric understanding of this. Let me correct this. I don't think people would be like, wow, now I believe, because God explained to Joshua that, it's like, again, sort of the I will believe if. It's like, no, you won't. But, getting back to actually, before I thought, the details. And actually, again, studying history, there are incredible levels of detail in the Gospels for people who are willing to look at it. Again, Richard Bauckham, Jesus and the Eyewitnesses. If you can read Jesus and the Eyewitnesses and at least not come away convinced that it is reasonable to treat the Gospels like historical eyewitness accounts, I would be amazed if you can come away from that book and say, no chance they're historical.
Right.
Because one of the things he talks about is the ways that, Luke in particular. So, Zacchaeus climbs a sycamore tree. Sycamore trees grow in a very specific place. How does Luke know this? He's never been there. And how does he find out about this? He talks to people. He talks to people who have been there, right? The names in the gospel accounts, in terms of the frequency these names occur, roughly match up to the frequency of names we find in historical records. Well, that's really interesting. If I were going to write a novel about 18th century France, even with the internet, what are the chances that I'm going to get the distribution of names right? Not very good. but the gospel writers do it. The gospel writers have details and names and historical details that it is going to be pretty much impossible for you to get right as much as they got right without having been there, or at least having talked to people there who were there. So there are a lot of details there for people who are willing to look for them.
Yeah.
The last thing I want to say is, about the inconsistencies in the Gospels is, the early church freely admitted that there were inconsistencies in the Gospels. And for them, it was actually evidence in favor of their reliability. The early church, because what happened was, different churches had different gospels, and as they started circulating them, they started realizing, wow, look how much these agree with one another. They didn't see the disagreements; they saw the agreement.
Yeah.
And for them, the idea that all of these different accounts could agree on what mattered, they held up those inconsistencies as evidence of the reliability of the narrative. So their view, and again, they knew all about those, and they freely admitted them, and they saw it in completely the reverse as we did. They saw it as evidence for the strength of the gospel story because of how similar they all were.
That's so interesting. It seems like, I wonder, why did people start feeling compelled to treat God's word differently, in which our mentality now is, oh my gosh, we find an inconsistency or something conflicting, and that invalidates the whole thing. I mean, did that develop post-Reformation, or was that in response to modernism? Or, I mean, why are we here in regards to how Bible reading is taught?
Yeah, well, I think there are different strains depending on who you're talking about. I mean, I think that, in our country, in our culture, a lot of it came from, I'll say, poorly educated backwoods preachers who had one book and developed theories about that book and what it meant and how to interpret it that really never would have been considered theologically valid by, I'll say, knowledgeable theologians in any era of the church. And,
Yeah, I do. I think that maybe one of the things that has given the most tools to people who want to tear down the Bible is the insistence on reading it all literally, right? The sort of the very modern insistence in there is one correct reading of the Bible, and it is a literal one. You want to set up the Bible to be knocked down really easily. That's the tack you take.
Yeah.
And that's the idea that there is only one correct reading of any passage, and that is, it is to be literally understood, and that everything in the Bible is literally perfect and correct. That is a very modern way of using the Bible, and it is not one that, anyone in the vast majority of church history, the Bible's never treated that way.
Yeah. Awesome. All right, couple more questions. One is, do y'all have any theories on why Jesus was apparently so unrecognizable post-resurrection? Like, here he is interacting with his pals for 3 years, and they don't even know that they're talking to him. I've heard one, I think it's kind of a funny theory, but I guess maybe it's a possibility, is like, when you have a friend that has had a beard for so long and then he shaves the beard, and you're just like, oh my gosh, you just look so different. This one guy hypothesizes that because they pulled Jesus's beard out, that he was just beardless, and people are like, I just don't know who you are.
I guess I don't know, Jack, I don't know, I've ever talked about this. My guess has always been, so in Isaiah 52, 53, where there's this extended prophecy about the Messiah, and it says that his face was marred beyond, depending on the translation, beyond any man. Yeah. And then one translation talks about it was marred beyond human likeness or something like that. And that's the way I've taken it, is that he was beaten so badly that his face was it swollen? But it was, his face was smashed. And so he looked really different. Yeah. I think the other deal is, like, when you've just seen someone killed in front of you, if you run into a living person a few days later, your assumption is not going to be, I'll bet that's not going to be your thought, right? It's not. And so I do think that part of it is that,
They saw him get killed.
Yeah.
And he was dead. And your first thought is not going to be, I wonder if he made it. Or,
right.
Gosh, that guy's familiar. They might have thought he looks really familiar, but they certainly wouldn't have thought it's Jesus. Because, again, the idea of a physical resurrection was not something that anyone was expecting.
Right. Right. Is there anything that we, like, how y'all's minds work? I don't know if y'all do a lot of speculating about the afterlife, especially for Christians, heaven and all that. But do you think that post-resurrection Jesus teaches us anything about our eternal state of existence? So, like, for example, Jesus...
We're going to be able to phase through doors?
Yeah, that, and he ate food, and, I mean...
Oh, yes. So, yeah, one thing about and again, this would have been very, not to ancient Jewish beliefs, but very contrary to ancient, Greek and Roman religion and ancient philosophy. Jesus' bodily resurrection was sort of the ultimate affirmation of physical creation, right? Like, the physical world is not evil. The physical world is not something to escape. It's sort of the reaffirmation of the, God's proclamation during creation that it was very good. So it's sort of the reaffirmation that creation is still good. God's not doing away with the physical, right? So in that sense, that is one thing. Is that the physical is good.
Yeah.
The physical is, resurrection was the affirmation of that.
Yeah. Well, this has been awesome. I appreciate y'all's time, and happy Easter, and I'm glad that you guys believe.